The question hung heavy in the air, a question whispered among weary soldiers huddled around flickering fires. Could innocence truly exist amidst the chaos of war? Could a semblance of humanity survive the brutal machinery of conflict? The year was 1944. The relentless march of the Allied forces had pushed deep into the heart of France, liberating villages and towns from the iron grip of the German occupation. But liberation came at a price. The landscape was scarred, the people traumatized, and the air thick with suspicion. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every whisper carried the potential for betrayal. Private Thomas Baker wiped the grime from his brow, the dust of a shattered nation clinging to his skin. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a face that still held the remnants of boyhood. But the war had aged him, etching lines of worry and weariness around his eyes. He longed for home, for the familiar comfort of his mother's cooking and the easy laughter of his friends. But home felt like a distant dream, a world away from the grim reality of the present. His unit, a small patrol of 5 men, was tasked with securing a recently liberated village. The fighting had been fierce, leaving the village a ghost of its former self. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were littered with debris, and the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of a collapsing structure or the mournful cry of a distant dog. Thomas and his comrades moved cautiously through the deserted streets, their rifles held at the ready. Sergeant Miller, a seasoned veteran with a hard face and a quiet demeanor, led the way. He had seen more than his fair share of combat, and his instincts were sharp. He trusted no one and nothing, a survival trait honed by years of war. The patrol had been instructed to search every house, every cellar, every hiding place for any remaining German soldiers or collaborators. The orders were clear: eliminate any threat. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The village felt too empty, too quiet. It was as if the inhabitants had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the ghosts of their former lives. As they approached a seemingly abandoned house, Sergeant Miller raised his hand, signaling the patrol to halt. The house was small and unassuming, its windows boarded up, its door hanging precariously on its hinges. But something about it felt off. A faint scent of wood smoke lingered in the air, suggesting that someone had been there recently. "Baker, check the cellar," Sergeant Miller ordered, his voice low and gravelly. Thomas swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He hated cellars. They were dark, damp, and filled with unseen dangers. But orders were orders. He gripped his rifle tightly and approached the cellar door, a rickety wooden hatch in the ground. With a deep breath, he pulled open the hatch, revealing a narrow, steep staircase leading down into the darkness. The air that wafted up from the cellar was cold and musty, carrying with it the faint odor of mildew and decay. "Hello?" Thomas called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Anyone down there? We're American soldiers." "We're here to help." Silence. Only the echo of his own voice answered him. He hesitated for a moment, then began to descend the stairs, his boots scraping against the damp stone. The darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. He fumbled for his flashlight and switched it on, the beam cutting through the gloom, revealing a small, cramped cellar. Jars of preserved vegetables lined the shelves, their contents long since spoiled. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the far corner of the cellar, huddled beneath a tattered blanket, was a figure. Thomas approached cautiously, his rifle still raised. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice softer now. "We're not going to hurt you." The figure stirred, and a woman emerged from beneath the blanket. She was young, no older than 20, with a pale, gaunt face and wide, frightened eyes. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and her hair was matted and unkempt. But despite her disheveled appearance, there was a spark of defiance in her gaze. Thomas lowered his rifle slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you hurt?" The woman didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. "We're here to help," Thomas repeated. "We're American soldiers. The village has been liberated." A flicker of understanding crossed the woman's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. "Elise," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Elise," Thomas repeated. "My name is Thomas. We're going to get you out of here, Elise. You're safe now." He reached out his hand to help her up, but she flinched away from him, her eyes widening with terror. "It's okay," Thomas said, his voice reassuring. "I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly, hesitantly, Elise reached out and took his hand. Her hand was cold and trembling. Thomas helped her to her feet, and together they made their way back up the stairs and into the light. Sergeant Miller and the other soldiers were waiting outside the house. They watched in silence as Thomas emerged from the cellar, leading Elise by the hand. Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice hard. "Her name is Elise," Thomas replied. "She was hiding in the cellar. She's just a civilian." Sergeant Miller approached Elise, his gaze cold and assessing. "Do you speak English?" he asked. Elise shook her head. Sergeant Miller turned to Thomas. "Ask her if she knows anything about the Germans," he said. "Ask her if she's seen any collaborators." Thomas translated the questions into French, and Elise answered in a low, rapid voice. "She says she doesn't know anything," Thomas reported. "She says she's been hiding in the cellar for days." Sergeant Miller studied Elise for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Take her back to the command post," he ordered. "Let the intelligence officers question her." Thomas nodded and led Elise away, the other soldiers falling in behind them. As they walked through the village, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sergeant Miller's reaction had been too cold, too calculating, and Elise seemed more frightened than a simple civilian should be. The command post was located in the village's former schoolhouse, a large, imposing building that had been converted into a makeshift headquarters. Thomas led Elise inside and handed her over to a pair of intelligence officers, a man and a woman who looked equally grim and weary. The officers took Elise into a small, windowless room and began to question her, speaking in rapid French. Thomas waited outside, pacing nervously. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something wrong. He had found a frightened woman hiding in a cellar, and now she was being interrogated like a criminal. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers emerged from the room, their faces grim. "What's going on?" Thomas asked. "Is she all right?" The male officer shook his head. "She's lying," he said. "She knows more than she's letting on." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his heart sinking. "She claims she's been hiding in the cellar for days, but her story doesn't add up. She's too clean, too well fed, and she's wearing clothes that are too expensive for a simple peasant." "But she's just a woman," Thomas protested. "She's scared. We've seen it before, son," the female officer said, her voice weary. "They all play the victim, but some of them are more dangerous than any soldier." "What are you going to do with her?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're going to find out what she knows," the male officer replied. "One way or another." Thomas watched as the officers led Elise away, her face pale and drawn. He wanted to say something, to do something, but he was frozen in place, his mind reeling. He had stumbled upon a mystery, a web of secrets and lies that threatened to consume him. Back at his unit, Sergeant Miller was waiting for him. "What did they say?" he asked. "They think she's lying," Thomas replied. "They think she knows something." Sergeant Miller nodded slowly. "I had a feeling about her," he said. "There was something about her that didn't seem right." "But what if she's innocent?" Thomas asked. "What if she's just scared?" Sergeant Miller looked at Thomas, his eyes hard and unforgiving. "In war, there is no such thing as innocent," he said. "Everyone is guilty of something." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his cot, haunted by the image of Elise's frightened face. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had betrayed her, that he had handed her over to a system that would crush her without mercy. He decided he had to do something. He had to find out the truth about Elise. He had to prove that she was innocent. But how? He was just a private, a cog in the vast machine of war. What could he possibly do? As he lay there in the darkness, a plan began to form in his mind. It was a risky plan, a dangerous plan, but it was the only way he could think of to help Elise. The next morning, Thomas approached the intelligence officers and asked if he could speak to Elise again. He told them that he thought he could get her to open up, that he could gain her trust. The officers were skeptical, but they eventually agreed to let him see her under strict supervision. Thomas entered the small, windowless room where Elise was being held. She was sitting on a cot, her head in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "Elise," Thomas said softly, "I want to help you." Elise didn't answer. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't believe that you're a collaborator," Thomas continued. I think you're just a victim of this war. Elise's eyes flickered. Why would you help me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You don't even know me. Because I believe in justice, Thomas replied. And I believe that everyone deserves a chance to tell their story. He paused, then added, but I need you to be honest with me, Elise. I need you to tell me the truth. Elise hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. I am not a collaborator, she said, but I am hiding something. Thomas leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. What are you hiding? He asked. Elise looked around the room as if afraid of being overheard. My brother, she whispered. He is a member of the French resistance. Thomas's eyes widened. Your brother is a resistance fighter, he asked. Elise nodded. He was injured in a raid, she said. I am hiding him in the cellar of the house. But why didn't you tell us this before? Thomas asked. We could have helped him. I was afraid, Elise replied. I didn't know who to trust. I thought you would arrest him. Thomas understood. He knew that the American army was suspicious of the French resistance, that they often viewed them as unreliable and unpredictable. I won't arrest him, Thomas said. I promise, but we need to get him out of the village. The Germans will be back soon, and if they find him, they will kill him. Elise nodded. I know, she said, but how can we get him out? The village is surrounded by soldiers. Thomas thought for a moment. I have a plan, he said, but it's risky. We'll need to be careful. He explained his plan to Elise, and she listened intently, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. When he was finished, she took a deep breath and nodded. I will do it, she said. I trust you. That night, under the cover of darkness, Thomas and Elise slipped out of the command post and made their way back to the abandoned house. Thomas carried a stretcher, and Elise led the way, her footsteps light and silent. They entered the cellar and found Elise's brother, a young man with a pale face and a bandaged leg. He was weak and in pain, but he managed a weak smile when he saw his sister. Thomas and Elise carefully lifted him onto the stretcher and carried him out of the cellar. They made their way through the deserted streets, avoiding the patrols of soldiers. They reached the edge of the village and slipped into the woods. Thomas knew of a safe house, a farm several miles away where they could hide Elise's brother until he was well enough to travel. As they walked through the woods, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but he saw nothing. Suddenly, a shot rang out, shattering the silence of the night. Thomas felt a searing pain in his arm, and he stumbled and fell to the ground. Elise screamed and dropped to her knees beside him. Thomas, she cried. Are you all right? Thomas gritted his teeth and tried to get up, but his arm was too weak. He looked around, trying to locate the source of the shot. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was Sergeant Miller. What are you doing, Baker? Sergeant Miller demanded, his voice cold and hard. Where are you going with that man? Thomas stared at Sergeant Miller, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe that his own sergeant had shot him. I'm helping him, Thomas replied, his voice weak. He's a member of the French resistance. He's been injured. Sergeant Miller shook his head. You're a fool, Baker, he said. You've been deceived. That man is a traitor. No, he's not, Thomas protested. He's fighting for our freedom. Sergeant Miller raised his rifle. You're going to have to come with me, Baker, he said. You're under arrest. Thomas knew that he was in trouble. He knew that Sergeant Miller wouldn't hesitate to kill him. He looked at Elise, her face pale with fear. He had to protect her. He had to protect her brother. With a surge of adrenaline, Thomas lunged at Sergeant Miller, knocking the rifle out of his hands. The two men grappled on the ground, struggling for control. Elise screamed and ran towards them, trying to pull Sergeant Miller off of Thomas. But Sergeant Miller was too strong. He shoved Elise away and pinned Thomas to the ground. I'm sorry, Baker, Sergeant Miller said, his voice cold and emotionless. But you've left me no choice. He raised his knife and plunged it into Thomas's chest. Thomas gasped and closed his eyes. He felt a sharp pain, and then everything went black. Elise screamed again, her voice filled with anguish. She watched as Sergeant Miller stood up and walked away, leaving Thomas lying on the ground, bleeding to death. She knelt beside Thomas and cradled his head in her arms. Thomas, she whispered, please don't die, please. Thomas opened his eyes, his gaze weak and unfocused. He looked at Elise, and a faint smile crossed his lips. It's okay, he whispered. I'm glad I could help you. He closed his eyes again, and his breathing stopped. Elise wept, her tears falling onto Thomas's face. She had lost a friend, a savior. and she knew that she was still in danger. Suddenly, she heard a noise in the woods. She looked up and saw a group of soldiers approaching. They were American soldiers, but they weren't from Thomas's unit. The soldiers approached cautiously, their rifles raised. "Who are you?" one of them demanded. "What happened here?" Elise looked at the soldiers, her mind racing. She knew that she couldn't trust them. She knew that they would arrest her and her brother. She made a decision. She had to protect her brother. She had to escape. She took a deep breath and stood up, her eyes filled with determination. "I am a member of the French resistance," she said. "And this man," she gestured to Thomas's body, "was helping us fight the Germans." The soldiers looked at each other, their faces uncertain. "What about him?" one of them asked, pointing to Elise's brother, who was still lying on the stretcher. "He is my brother," Elise replied. "He was injured in a raid. We need to get him to safety." The soldiers hesitated for a moment, then lowered their rifles. "All right," one of them said. "We'll help you, but you're going to have to come with us." Elise nodded and helped the soldiers lift her brother onto the stretcher. Together, they carried him through the woods towards the safe house. As they walked, Elise couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Sergeant Miller. Had he been caught? Had he been punished for his crime? She knew that she might never know the answer. But she also knew that she would never forget Thomas Baker, the young soldier who had risked his life to help her, the soldier who had shown her that even in the darkest of times, there was still hope for humanity. The truth was far more complicated than she could ever imagine. The safe house turned out to be not so safe. As they approached, the windows shattered and gunfire erupted. The soldiers who had rescued her were not who they seemed. They were German soldiers in disguise, and the safe house was a trap. They had been waiting for her. They had been waiting for her brother, and now they had them. Elise stood frozen, the weight of the betrayal crushing her. Thomas had died for nothing. She had led her brother into a deadly trap. But as the German soldiers advanced, a new figure emerged from the shadows. A figure in an American uniform, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury, Sergeant Miller. But why? Whose side was he on? Had he set her up from the beginning? Or was this some kind of twisted game? "Hello, Elise," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Welcome to the real war."